My funniest time on a podcast was when I did an entire hour's podcast, and it turned out that the only audio that was being recorded was me. So it looked as though I had just gone off on one for about an hour, and I re-recorded the episode, but the host then put it on his Patreon as like a sort of Patreon bonus episode, so people can just watch me essentially going mental in my flat for an hour.
I like it.
Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I'm Gemma Files, and this, of course, is No Darkness, but Ours.
Okay, so we have a special guest on the podcast with us tonight, Ally Wilkes, author of All the White Spaces, which Gemma and I talked about in our very first podcast. We actually called that episode All the White Spaces, indeed, and most recently of Where the Dead Wait, which is published, I think, this month in the US and next month in the UK, and it's awesome. And we've read it in advance, and you have not, so no. Also, the author is A.V. Wilkes of Jamie Hallow and the End of the World, which is a sort of YA queer romance and Lovecraftian horror, post-apocalyptic Lovecraftian horror story. I think that's a reasonable. Is that a fair description, Ally?
Yeah. You've covered most of the bases there.
Okay, so just before we dive in, I want to do one quick recommendation, because the movie we watched tonight, which I think you guys would love, and I think all our listeners would love, which is a film called It's a Wonderful Knife. You heard that title correctly. It is basically a queer romance slasher version of It's a Wonderful Life, if you can picture that, with a cast including Catherine Isabel from Ginger Snaps, Joel McHale from Community, and Justin Long as a really evil bastard Donald Trump stroke serial killer type. Can't recommend it. We laughed a great deal and enjoyed it a lot. So I think this, along with Joe Begos's Christmas Bloody Christmas, this may become like a regular seasonal movie in our home. So
That's on Shudder, right?
On Shudder. Yeah,
that's what I thought. I'd like to recommend The Sacrifice Game, which is also on Shudder, and also takes place around Christmas and is also a lot of fun.
I had a look for that the other night. Unfortunately, I don't think it's on Shudder in the UK.
That's annoying. That's really annoying.
But
Shudder in the UK is terrible. It's got a really attenuated catalogue compared to the US. Every month I see on Twitter this massive list of things making it onto Shudder US, and we'll get like 3 of them. Amazing.
Oh, God.
And it's a nightmare to try and navigate. You could only get to see about half the films that are actually on there.
Yeah.
When you go onto the actual page, it's we rewatched a couple that we'd seen a while back. None of which you could actually find by going onto Shudder's homepage and navigating any of the stuff there. It was just like, tag that one in. Is it still available? Yes, it is. The Mortuary Collection. Let's watch that again. But yes, that's very annoying. But we did watch The Elevator Game on Shudder, the something game, which is a very good
it's not bad. I mean, I want to support Rebecca McKendry, the director, because she sort of is a friend of mine, and B she did Glorious, but but given how amazing and weird Glorious was, I was kind of expecting more.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's been a while since we've seen Glorious. I definitely loved the bit when he just tried to stick his whatnot through the glory hole, and the Lovecraftian being just goes, "What is that?"
It's like, no.
Do you have any movie recommendations that you'd like to share with the listeners, Ally?
If we're doing seasonal Christmassy horror, I'm always going to recommend Anna and the Apocalypse, because it's just good fun. I normally hate musicals, but this is a high school zombie musical set at Christmas, and it's just a laugh.
I actually had no idea that it was set at Christmas, so I'm going to check that out now.
It's extremely Christmassy. There is a big Christmas tree on fire. There is someone in a snowman costume who's a zombie who has to be beaten to death, and one of the climactic chase scenes takes place in a Christmas tree lot. So it's got it all there, and some really horrible jumpers. Great,
that's wonderful. The overall Christmas movie that I always have to put an oar in for is of course Black Christmas, original Black Christmas 1980, which is not only a Christmas horror movie but also CanCon, because it was shot up here.
Of course, we've got the box set of the BBC ghost stories for Christmas, the classic sort of 1970s ones. I found the modern ones can be a little bit hit and miss. There's often a bit of a tendency to try and shoehorn some kind of message here because the actual story isn't good enough. We've got to try and stick some kind of baggage on. But I mean, the adaptation of Count Magnus most recently was, I thought, brilliant. So I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to see what they've got this year. But I think I do have the Box of Delights on DVD as well, which isn't strictly horror. But unfortunately, again, it's one of the things that my other half and I don't quite click with, much like Blake Seven and Tom Baker era Doctor Who. I think you kind of had to be there at the time, at least as far as Kate's concerned. She's sort of like never been able to take Blake Seven seriously, which is admittedly a lot of people can't, but I absolutely love that show. And as I say, I've always been amused when people, as we were saying in a previous edition, when you see some people, American viewers, putting up things like the bleakest ending to a science fiction show ever was like the end of Quantum Leap, and you're like,
you have no idea.
Yeah. I was 7 when I saw the last episode of Blake Seven, and I think I still have PTSD. Frankly, okay. So
yes.
Ali, so your new novel, as I say, is Where the Dead Wait. As I say, Gemma and I both absolutely loved it, and obviously we want to try and keep this as spoiler-free as we can while doing something other than just squeeing like fanboys and fangirls for the next hour. But do you want to, for those viewers who haven't read it yet, do you want to try and give us a quick précis of what they're in for?
Okay. So the story revolves around William Day, who in the 1860s comes back from a doomed expedition to the Arctic as one of the very few last survivors. And that expedition really leaves him with an awful reputation because people were killed and eaten for food. There was a lot of murder. The death count was abnormally high. No one quite knows what went on. So he's been living in disgrace ever since then. This main story takes place 13 years later when he finds that his second in command, a man who made an extremely big impact on his life, Jesse Stevens, has gone missing on his own expedition to the Arctic. And the British Admiralty sees fit to equip him with the means to go out and find Jesse Stevens wherever he may be. It's a difficult journey for Day because he's forced to confront a lot of the lies and mysteries and repercussions of what he did on his last journey out there, but also because he is saddled with an inquisitive reporter who is a total fanboy and very obsessed with finding out the truth about what happened last time, but also, even worse, Jesse Stevens' wife, who is a famous spirit medium.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of stuff going into the mix.
I
mean, the whole thing of the spirit man, because again, this is something that you don't think of as being associated with those polar expeditions, but it does kind of create this whole very different vibe and a very different atmosphere and these very different interactions. And speaking of fanboys, of course, Day's got one of his own, hasn't he, in the form of young Peters. And I've got to say, I really love the way these characters developed and how they often kind of confounded. They didn't always. A lot of them didn't develop in quite the way I thought they were going to, which I love. I love being kind of being surprised like that. I mean, it struck me. I mean, like with both with this and with All the White Spaces, there's each of the protagonists has a kind of the physical journey they're undertaking kind of parallels their mental and emotional and spiritual one. In a sense, like Jonathan in All the White Spaces. I mean, we talked a lot in our first podcast about the idea of penetrating the dead space of all these things about they're basically about going somewhere where you're not supposed to go, and in a way, Jonathan's trying to do that with a world of masculinity, of this almost hyper masculine culture that's kind of been he's like that's been denied to him based on the agenda he's been assigned at birth, and at the same time he's involved in an expedition that's trying to do the same as that on a macro scale. And in both cases they find out that when they actually get where they want to go, it's not quite what they thought it was going to be. It's more complicated, it's more messy, and it's a hell of a lot more scary. And with Day, he's kind of going back somewhere and he's having to confront a whole load of shit that he thought he'd buried and left behind. And so there's that kind of paralleling of almost like the internal and the external. I mean, is that something that you intended from the start, or is it something that just emerged as you wrote the
books?
Yeah.
See, I think I always like to think about the character's arc before I start writing. And one of the main reasons I write polar fiction, or one of the main reasons I've written these two books, is because I'm very fascinated by expedition narratives from the heroic age. And one thing that it always strikes me, you get people saying again and again and again in these first-hand accounts, is that you don't really know someone until you've been on a polar expedition with them. You don't really have a sense of someone's true character until you've seen them in extremis.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I always try and explore that by taking people who reveal aspects of themselves that they maybe wouldn't have gone through their lives never revealing, except under this extreme pressure cooker environment. And I just think that's great fun to play with.
Very much. Yeah, I mean, it's the idea of an eat or be eaten world, the idea of, when it comes to choosing what to do, which side are you going to fall on? Are you going to be the person who looks at your fellows as potential meat, or are you going to be the person who tries to feed your potential fellows? Something I found interesting, I mean, I don't think it's giving too much away to say that both of these books are pretty queer, and there's large, currents, not even undercurrents, just currents, and part of Day's journey is realizing how much what he thinks is a secret about him is not a secret, and has never been a secret, and never needed to be a secret to some degree. And his allowance of or acceptance of the mantle of, oh yeah, that's right, this was all my fault. I'm Edom Fresh Day. Yep, absolutely, that's me. It's like, and Jesse's wonderful. It's sort of like a strange act of love to allow all the blame to fall on him.
Kind of got Stevens on a sort of an idea, almost on a pedestal, kind of idealized figure, even though it's pretty obvious that Stevens isn't this. Except, I suppose, in the sense that Stevens just does what the fuck he likes.
That man has blue and orange morality. He doesn't really know what the fuck the normal standards of society are, or if he does know, he doesn't care to follow them in the least.
Yeah, exactly. He knows he doesn't like them. That's what he knows. It's like, where's the place I've been the happiest?
Yes. Surrounded by bones and the bodies of my dying comrades. Excellent.
I think when I was in my teens.
Oh, sorry, Simon.
I was thinking a very good friend of mine when I was in my teens and early 20s was very much somebody who he very much did his own thing, and he didn't give a shit. He didn't. I mean, in many ways, he didn't have a job. He just tended to smoke weed and talk philosophy a lot. But it was amazing how many girlfriends he had, and all of them all said the same thing. You know, it's kind of because he was quite extreme in many ways, because he just did what the fuck he liked. He knew what he wanted. He knew what he was. That was very attractive. He didn't, you know, he didn't dither. He didn't pretend. He was what he was, and that was very, and there was a great deal, and there was a degree of charm in that.
And similarly, there is a degree of charm in Stevens, I think, for Day, because he accepts himself completely.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. And
he owns it.
Yeah, totally owns it. I got to admit, with every description that you had of his lovely blue eyes and his lovely golden hair, I was like, are you thinking of Dan Stevens?
Well, I am now.
I can see that casting working very well, I will admit.
I am now.
I love the fact, you know, you managed to write these great queer characters who at the same time, you know, there's no need, you know, you're quite happy to show them in all their complexity and all their often not so pleasant qualities. Well, I mean, Stevens is, let's face it, this guy is not any kind of role model. But I mean, Day, one of the really interesting things, and it kind of goes back to what you said about how you never know someone until they're in that kind of an extremist kind of situation, is that Day is not the kind of character you'd often expect to be the protagonist of this, because he is somebody who has kind of been tested and found wanting in many respects, both on the initial journey. I mean, certainly, I think over the course of the novel, he kind of, as he comes to terms with who he becomes more effective. But certainly in the early stages of the voyage, he's all at sea, as it were.
Yes.
In many ways, if it wasn't for, you know, some of the people he's got around him, he'd be completely screwed. And it's kind of interesting to have someone like that as a protagonist, because of course you do sympathise with him, because part of you's thinking, would I be any more use in that position? Probably not.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I liked about William Day as a character to explore, because he was getting in the story a very meaningful second chance. And as you rightly observe, through the first half of the book, maybe even the first 3/4 of the book, he royally pisses all over that second chance. He's just not great. But I think that's true to life and true to the difficult predicament he's been put in, because he is essentially the embodiment of imposter syndrome. He's someone who, when he was very, very young, was forced to assume command of this doomed mission after his mentor died. He's forced to drag the men over the ice as they die one by one. He's forced to make all these absolutely unbearable decisions, and he just doesn't think he's good enough. And so he leans on Stevens, because Stevens is himself. Stevens does seem to always know what to do. And I think we all know the sort of allure of that, the allure when we feel totally at sea of someone being like, look, I've got you. This is what's going to happen. Just stick with me and it'll all turn out all right. Yeah. So I think that's a sort of seductive allure that we can all sort of empathise with. As can we empathise with being given a second chance and maybe then needing a second chance 2.1 or 2.2, just as it really sort of sinks in. Because the way I conceived the two narratives, and it won't surprise any readers to know that you find out a lot about the first expedition as Day goes through the second expedition.
Yes, and I love that weaving, that interweaving.
One of them is a redemption arc and one of them is a corruption arc. And I think you can have a lot of fun juxtaposing those and also showing the setbacks to each, because humans are very, very rarely black and white.
Yeah. There's there's that old question of, or rather that old line from Unforgiven, deserve's got nothing to do with it. And I think that in a lot of ways, Day has convinced himself that he deserved what happened. And he doesn't deserve a shot at redemption, you know.
Yes.
And it isn't until he realizes that he has to be in the moment and deal with things that are right in front of him, as opposed to the things that happened many years ago, and that has nothing to do with it. That, you know, he doesn't deserve anything, to live or to die, to get better or get worse, to do evil or to do good. He doesn't deserve it simply because of who he is.
Mm.
Because a lot of that imposter syndrome certainly seems to be rooted in his sense of his own sexuality as like a mistake, or you know, like a failing in himself. It's like, oh, if only you were a real guy, his dad is always saying in the back of his head. You know?
Yeah, it's one of the fundamental.
You know how to deal with this absolutely impossible fucking situation.
It's one of the fundamental differences between him and, I think, Jonathan in All the White Spaces, which is Jonathan has got all those kind of qualities for a polar explorer. He's got that kind of willpower and that kind of zeal of the convert, hyper patriotic, hyper masculine kind of sense of who he is. The only thing that's in Jonathan's way is the fact that he's basically
female birth.
Yeah. Whereas Day's kind of got that access by birthright.
Yeah.
It's just that he because of who he is,
he keeps undercutting himself.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. He's hiding. And
as you say, Day had it all. He had, the introduction to the Admiralty. He has a mentor on board the first expedition, Captain Talbot, who takes him under his wing and teaches him what's what, etc. But all of that just goes very slowly to shit over the course of 3 years trapped in the Arctic ice. And he comes back absolutely demonized, but also believing that everyone is correct in demonizing him.
Yeah, he deserves it, kind of thing.
Yeah, he deserves it.
He reminds me, sometimes I think with him, he reminds me of certain other fictional characters, like, Jules Denby's Billy Morgan, a very different novel, but one of the things that always struck me about it is that in both cases these are characters who are kind of a lot harder on themselves than they deserve to be, but at the same time, one of the things that makes them in a way more interesting or more appealing to the reader is the fact that they are so hard on themselves. The fact that they do. If they just shrugged it off and readily accepted, shit happens kind of thing, then we probably wouldn't like them as much. But the fact that they actually feel that they've fallen short, and it's something that they kind of come to recognise. Well, no, it's this isn't a case of just me being awful.
It's a case of the world being difficult.
Yeah. And in Day's case, he has a very, of course, real reminder of his shortcomings around him the entire time. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler because he appears in the first chapter, but Day has been plagued ever since he came back from the Arctic with the ghostly apparition of Jesse Stevens, who seems to follow him around and be trying to communicate with him. And so he's got a very real reminder every day of what this noble polar explorer with the furs and the dead Arctic fox and the cheekbones looks like. And he's forced to carry that with him while he goes about his day-to-day life as a recluse and a bit of a tabloid laughingstock in London. It must be phenomenally difficult.
Yeah, doesn't really lend itself to kind of trying to put it behind you and get over the shit.
Not really.
He has been denied all form of, as we would say, closure.
Yes. So if nothing else, he hopes to get that out of this. It's like, maybe I'll just find, Stevens's bones in the ice somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. I think he desperately wants to find Stevens and restore his reputation, but there's a sort of undercurrent of, well, if all I do is I get to the Arctic and then the ice is too bad and I have to turn back, at least I can add into like history's footnotes that I tried, that I did something, that I've tried something to redeem everything else that went on with my life.
Absolutely.
I think there's definitely part of him that sort of wants almost wants that to happen, almost wants the get out clause of, well, sailed around, it was terrible, thanks, bye.
Yeah. Ship wasn't there, we couldn't find the trail.
Ship wasn't there, we had to look after this woman who was on board this Arctic sailing ship. It's terrible, we can't let her come to any harm, we've turned back. What a shame.
Ally Wilkes' second novel, Where the Dead Wait, was published in the US on 5th of December 2023 by Atria Books and is out from Titan Books on the 23rd of January 2024 in the UK. And we'll be back next week with the second part of our conversation with Ally Wilkes. But until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
I remain Gemma Files, and this, of course, is always no darkness but ours.